Dr. Sarah Chen pressed her stethoscope against the chest of another veteran, listening to the familiar rhythm that told stories of battles fought and survived. The VA hospital's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she moved from bed to bed, her quiet efficiency masking the weight she carried in her own chest. Each patient she treated reminded her of faces she'd known, voices she'd heard calling for help in places where help seemed impossible. The morning shift at the Denver VA Medical Center had become her sanctuary. Here, among the wounded warriors, she found purpose in healing what could be healed and comforting what couldn't be fixed. Her colleagues knew her as the thoracic surgeon who never missed a detail, never lost a patient unnecessarily, and never spoke about her past. They respected her skill and her silence in equal measure. Sarah had been working at the hospital for 3 years now, building a reputation as someone who understood trauma in ways that textbooks couldn't teach. When other doctors struggled with difficult cases involving combat injuries, they called for Dr. Chen. She had an intuitive understanding of how shrapnel moved through the body, how blast injuries affected internal organs, and how the mind processed physical pain differently when it came from war. Her office was sparse, decorated only with her medical degrees and a single photograph of a sunrise over mountains. Colleagues had learned not to ask about the photo, just as they'd learned not to push when she deflected personal questions with gentle redirects toward medical discussions. Sarah preferred it that way. The past was a locked room she visited only in dreams that left her gasping awake at 3 a.m. The day started like any other, with rounds through the cardiac unit where she checked on post-surgical patients. There was Rodriguez, recovering from triple bypass surgery after years of untreated stress from his tours in Iraq. There was Williams, whose heart had been damaged by exposure to burn pits, now fighting for every beat. Each case required her full attention. Each decision carried the weight of someone's future. As she reviewed charts in the break room, Sarah noticed the unusual buzz of activity in the hallway. Nurses moved with purposeful urgency, and she caught fragments of conversation about a new admission coming in. Multiple trauma, they said. Critical condition. The words activated something in her nervous system, a readiness that she'd learned to manage but never quite suppress. Dr. Martinez, the head of emergency surgery, appeared in the doorway. His expression was serious, the kind that meant life and death decisions were coming fast. Sarah had worked with him long enough to read his moods and today carried the weight of something significant. Sarah, we need you in Trauma Bay 3, multiple GSWs, blast injuries, and what looks like severe cardiac trauma. The patient is stable for now, but barely. Flight medic said it's touch and go. He paused, studying her face. The thing is, this isn't a current combat injury. This patient has been carrying these wounds for months, maybe longer. Someone did field surgery to keep them alive, but it was emergency work. Now the body is failing. Sarah nodded, already mentally shifting into surgical mode. This was what she did best, taking the impossible cases where others saw only hopelessness. She'd built her career on saving the unsavable, on finding solutions when conventional medicine reached its limits. But as she walked toward the trauma bay, something in the atmosphere felt different. The usual hospital sounds seemed muted, and she noticed staff members watching her with an expression she couldn't quite identify. The patient had been sedated for transport, their face obscured by breathing apparatus and monitoring equipment. What struck Sarah first was the evidence of field medicine visible even through the hospital equipment. Someone had performed battlefield surgery with whatever tools were available, creating a patchwork of scars and temporary fixes that had somehow kept this person alive long enough to reach proper medical care. She began her examination methodically, her trained hands reading the story written in scar tissue and old wounds. This wasn't random trauma. This was the result of an explosion, probably an IED, followed by hours of careful medical intervention performed under impossible conditions. Someone had worked to save this life with determination that bordered on the miraculous. The surgical notes from the field medic were minimal but telling. Penetrating cardiac injury repaired with improvised materials. Collapsed lung reinflated using battlefield techniques. Blood loss controlled through pressure points and emergency transfusions. Each intervention showed knowledge that came from experience, not just training. As Sarah prepared for surgery, she found herself wondering about the medic who had performed the initial life-saving work. Military medical personnel were trained for these situations, but this level of skill and persistence suggested someone exceptional. The kind of medic who refused to accept death as an option, who found ways to keep hearts beating when every medical textbook said it was impossible. The surgery would be complex, requiring her to work around and improve upon the field repairs, while addressing new complications that had developed over time. But as she scrubbed in, Sarah felt the familiar calm that came with challenging cases. This was where she belonged, where her particular combination of skills and understanding could make the difference between life and death. She didn't know yet that the patient lying unconscious on her operating table carried secrets that would soon change everything. She thought she knew about her own story. She didn't know that in a few hours, when the anesthesia wore off and recognition dawned, the careful distance she'd maintained from her past would collapse entirely. For now there was only the surgery ahead, the intricate work of repairing a heart that had been broken by war and held together by someone's refusal to let it stop beating. Sarah entered the operating room with steady hands and a focused mind, unaware that she was about to perform the most important surgery of her career on someone whose life she had already saved once before, in a place far from home where death had come calling and been turned away by her own determination and skill. The operating room became Sarah's universe for the next 8 hours. Under the bright surgical lights, she worked with the precision that had made her reputation. But this case demanded something beyond technical skill. Every incision revealed the complexity of the field repairs that had kept this patient alive. Someone had performed miracles with basic medical supplies, turning what should have been fatal injuries into survivable wounds. As she carefully separated scar tissue from healthy heart muscle, Sarah found herself studying the original surgical work with growing amazement. The sutures were perfect despite being done under battlefield conditions. The placement of temporary patches showed understanding of cardiac anatomy that came from extensive training and practical experience. This wasn't the work of a field medic following protocols. This was the work of someone who understood hearts at a deeper level. "Dr. Chen, blood pressure is dropping," announced the anesthesiologist. Sarah's hands never paused as she adjusted her approach, working around a section of the heart where someone had performed an emergency bypass using materials that were never meant for cardiac surgery. The ingenuity was remarkable. Whoever had done this work had refused to accept limitations, finding ways to keep blood flowing when conventional options weren't available. The surgical team worked in focused silence, each member understanding that they were witnessing something unusual. Dr. Martinez observed from the gallery, occasionally making notes, but mostly watching Sarah work through what he would later describe as one of the most challenging cases he'd ever seen. The patient's vital signs remained stable, but barely, held in balance by Sarah's careful interventions and the mysterious field surgeon's earlier work. Hours passed as Sarah methodically repaired years of accumulated damage. She replaced the improvised patches with proper medical materials, rerouted blood vessels that had been temporarily diverted, and strengthened repairs that had been holding through sheer determination. But with each improvement, her respect for the original surgeon grew. They had saved this life under conditions that would have defeated most medical professionals. "Who did the initial surgery?" Sarah asked during a brief pause. The patient's medical records were incomplete, showing only recent treatment for deteriorating cardiac function with unknown cause. There was no mention of military service, no indication of combat injuries, no reference to the extensive field medicine that had clearly taken place. "Unknown," replied the surgical nurse. "Patient was found collapsed in a parking lot 3 days ago. No identification, no medical history we can access. The only thing we know is they kept asking for someone named Sarah when the paramedics found them." Sarah's hands stilled for a moment. The name could be coincidence. Sarah was common enough, but something in her chest tightened, a recognition that existed below conscious thought. She resumed her work, forcing herself to maintain professional detachment while her mind raced through possibilities she didn't want to consider. The final stage of surgery required her to address the original blast damage, injuries that had somehow been stabilized despite their severity. As she worked, Sarah began to recognize techniques she'd been taught years ago, methods that were specific to battlefield medicine and emergency cardiac repair, the kind of techniques taught to special operations medics who might need to perform surgery in hostile territory with minimal equipment. "This is incredible work," murmured Dr. Martinez through the intercom. "Whoever performed the original surgery saved this patient's life with materials that shouldn't have been sufficient. The skill level is extraordinary." Sarah nodded without looking up, but her heart rate had increased. The techniques were familiar because she had learned them in the same place, from the same instructors. The precision was familiar because she had practiced these exact procedures until they became instinct. The improvisation was familiar because she had used similar methods when conventional medicine wasn't possible. As the surgery neared completion, Sarah found herself studying the patient's hands. They were scarred from old injuries, calloused in ways that suggested weapons training and physical demands beyond normal life. When she checked for identifying marks, she found evidence of old shrapnel wounds that had healed without proper medical attention. This person had been hurt multiple times in multiple places and had somehow kept functioning despite injuries that should have been disabling. The final sutures went in perfectly, and Sarah stepped back as the anesthesia team began the process of bringing the patient back to consciousness. Her part was done. The heart would beat properly now, strengthened by modern materials and techniques. But questions filled her mind, questions that she couldn't shake despite her professional training in maintaining clinical distance. "Beautiful work, Sarah," Dr. Martinez said as he entered the OR. "You saved a life today. Whoever this person is, they owe you everything." Sarah nodded, but something in her expression must have shown her internal conflict because Dr. Martinez studied her carefully. He had known her for 3 years, had watched her save dozens of lives with the same quiet competence she'd shown today. But he had never seen her look uncertain after a successful surgery. "Are you all right? That was a long surgery, even for you." "I'm fine," Sarah replied automatically. "Just tired." It was a complex case, but she wasn't fine. As she cleaned up and prepared to leave the OR, Sarah couldn't escape the feeling that she had just participated in something significant, something that reached beyond medicine into her own carefully buried past. The patient would be unconscious for several more hours while their body processed the trauma of surgery. When they woke up, there would be answers to questions that Sarah wasn't sure she was ready to ask. She changed out of her surgical scrubs with mechanical precision, her mind replaying details from the surgery. The scar patterns, the evidence of multiple injuries, the sophisticated field medicine, the way the patient had allegedly asked for someone named Sarah. Each piece might be meaningless on its own, but together they created a picture that made her hands shake as she washed them one final time. Sarah had spent 3 years building a life where the past couldn't reach her. She had found peace in the routine of civilian medicine, in the clean environment of a modern hospital where death was the exception, rather than the constant companion it had been during her military service. But as she walked toward the recovery unit to check on her patient, she felt the careful walls she'd built beginning to crack under the weight of possibilities she'd never allowed herself to consider. The recovery room was quiet except for the steady beeping of monitors and the soft hush of ventilators. Sarah stood outside room 314, reading through the post-operative notes one more time. Though she had memorized every detail hours ago, inside her patient was beginning to emerge from anesthesia, vital signs stable and strong thanks to the successful surgery. But Sarah couldn't bring herself to enter the room. For 3 years, she had maintained perfect professional boundaries. She treated patients, saved lives, and went home to her small apartment where she lived alone with her memories locked away. She had built a life based on helping others heal while keeping her own wounds carefully hidden. But standing outside this room, she felt those boundaries dissolving like sugar in rain. The night nurse approached with an update. "Patient is conscious and responsive, asking for water and wondering where they are. Standard post-operative confusion. But the cognitive signs are all positive. Heart rate and blood pressure are better than we've seen since admission." Sarah nodded, still hesitating at the threshold. Through the small window in the door, she could see the patient attempting to sit up, clearly uncomfortable with the medical equipment but trying not to show it. Even in weakness, there was something disciplined about their movements, a controlled way of dealing with discomfort that spoke to training that went beyond civilian experience. Taking a deep breath, Sarah entered the room. The patient turned toward her, and in that moment the world shifted on its axis. She found herself looking into eyes she had seen in dreams for 3 years. Eyes that had watched her work miracles in places where miracles were the only thing standing between life and death. Eyes that belonged to Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, the Navy SEAL she had saved in a bombed-out building in Fallujah. "Doc?" His voice was rough from the breathing tube, but there was no mistaking the recognition. "Is it really you?" Sarah's professional composure cracked. The stethoscope fell from her nerveless fingers as memories came flooding back. The night when Torres had been brought to her field hospital, more dead than alive after an IED explosion had torn through his convoy. The 8 hours she had spent keeping his heart beating with improvised tools and determination that bordered on the supernatural. The moment when she had looked into his eyes and promised him he would make it home. "I told you that you would live," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the medical equipment. "I told you that you would make it home." Torres tried to smile, but the effort was painful. "You did more than that, Doc. You gave me 3 years I shouldn't have had. 3 years to see my daughter grow up, to walk her to school, to teach her how to throw a baseball. You gave me time I never thought I'd have." Sarah moved closer to the bed, her medical training warring with emotions she had suppressed for years. She checked his vital signs automatically, but her hands were shaking. The professional distance she maintained with all her patients was impossible with Torres. He represented everything she had tried to leave behind and everything she had been proud to accomplish. "The cardiac damage has progressed," she said, falling back on medical facts to steady herself. "Why didn't you seek treatment sooner? The repairs I made in Fallujah were never meant to be permanent." Torres looked away, and Sarah saw the weight of secrets in his expression. "I tried, Doc, but every time I went to a VA hospital, they asked questions I couldn't answer. Questions about where the injuries happened, who treated them, what unit I was with. The records of our operation were classified. Officially, I was never in that building with you. Officially, you never saved my life." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had known that their mission had been classified, that the field hospital where she had worked had been officially designated as a routine medical facility. But she hadn't considered the long-term implications for the soldiers she had treated there. They had become medical ghosts, carrying injuries that officially never happened, treated by doctors who officially were never there. "So you've been living with a deteriorating heart condition for 3 years, unable to get proper treatment, because the government classified the operation that injured you?" Sarah's voice carried a mix of anger and disbelief. "Not just me, Doc. Half the guys from that deployment are dealing with similar problems. Injuries that can't be explained, treatments that can't be documented, medical needs that officially don't exist." Torres struggled to sit up straighter. "But I'm not here just for me. I'm here because of what happened to the others." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. "What do you mean?" "Johnson died last year. Heart attack at 32. Peterson killed himself 6 months ago because the pain got too bad, and he couldn't get help. Rodriguez is missing, probably dead. The guys who made it out of that building with you are dying, Doc, and nobody cares because officially we were never there." The weight of Torres's words settled over Sarah like a heavy blanket. She had saved lives in that field hospital, worked miracles under impossible conditions, and believed that her patients had gone on to live full lives, learning that they had been abandoned by the system she had served, left to suffer and die because their injuries were politically inconvenient. Felt like a betrayal of everything she had sacrificed for. "I need to know what happened after I was evacuated," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. "I need to know why you and the others were left without support." Torres studied her face, seeing the same determination that had kept his heart beating in a bombed-out building 3 years earlier. "That's a long story, Doc, and it's not just about us. It's about you too, about why you left the military, about why you've been hiding in this hospital instead of using your skills where they're really needed." Sarah realized that saving Torres's heart was only the beginning. The surgery had been successful, but there were larger wounds to heal, wounds that went beyond medicine into the realm of justice and accountability. The quiet life she had built was about to be shattered, and for the first time in 3 years, she found herself ready to face whatever came next. "Tell me everything," she said, pulling a chair close to Torres's bed. "Tell me what they did to you and what they did to the others. Tell me why the system abandoned the people who sacrificed everything for their country." Torres nodded, recognizing the same fierce determination that had refused to let him die in Fallujah. "It started after you were suddenly reassigned," he began. "One day you were there, saving lives and performing miracles. The next day you were gone and nobody could tell us where or why." Torres's voice grew stronger as he began to tell the story that Sarah had never heard. She listened in growing horror as he described the systematic cover-up that had followed her sudden departure from the field hospital. What she had believed was a routine reassignment had actually been the first step in burying an operation that had gone wrong, in ways that reached far beyond the battlefield. The official story was that our convoy hit an IED on a routine patrol, Torres explained. But that wasn't what happened. We were on a classified mission to extract intelligence from a compound that was supposed to be empty. Someone fed us bad information. Someone wanted us to walk into that trap. Sarah remembered the night clearly now. Torres and his team had been brought in with injuries that were far too severe for a simple IED attack. The blast patterns had been wrong, the timing suspicious, and the subsequent emergency evacuation of the entire field hospital had never made sense to her. But as a military doctor, she had focused on saving lives rather than questioning orders. 3 days after you disappeared, they shut down the field hospital entirely, Torres continued. Moved all the patients to different facilities, scattered the staff across different assignments, and sealed all the medical records. When I tried to ask questions about my treatment, I was told that the information was classified and that discussing it could result in court-martial proceedings. Picture Torres painted was one of institutional betrayal that went beyond simple bureaucratic incompetence. Someone had deliberately destroyed the evidence of what had happened in that field hospital, and the soldiers who had been treated there had become inconvenient reminders of an operation that officially never existed. But you found out more, didn't you? Sarah asked, seeing something in Torres's expression that suggested deeper knowledge. You investigated on your own. Torres nodded grimly. I had to. When Johnson started having heart problems and couldn't get treatment, I knew something was seriously wrong. I started reaching out to other guys from the unit, trying to piece together what had happened. What I found was bigger than just our operation. He paused to rest, the conversation clearly taking a toll on his weakened system. Sarah checked his monitors automatically, but her attention was focused on his words rather than the medical data. She was beginning to understand that her own story was part of something much larger than she had realized. The compound we were sent to extract intelligence from was connected to an arms-dealing operation that involved American officials, Torres said. The intelligence we were supposed to recover would have exposed corruption that reached high into the military command structure. Someone made sure we never made it out with that information. Sarah felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Her sudden reassignment had never been explained properly. She had been told it was for her own safety, that the field hospital was being moved due to increased enemy activity in the area. But she had always suspected there was more to the story. What happened to me after I left? She asked. I was debriefed and then given a choice between a new assignment or discharge from the military. I chose discharge because I was told my service record would be sealed for national security reasons. They needed you gone because you were too good at your job, Torres replied. You saved lives that were supposed to die. You kept witnesses alive who were supposed to disappear along with the evidence of the operation. Your medical records from that night would have proven that our injuries were consistent with deliberate ambush, not accidental IED attack. The weight of this revelation settled over Sarah like a crushing burden. She had believed that her military service had ended honorably, that she had saved lives and made a difference. Learning that her skill and dedication had been seen as obstacles to be eliminated made her question everything she had believed about her service to her country. There's more, Torres said, watching her face carefully. After I started investigating, I discovered that similar operations had taken place in other locations. Field hospitals that were suddenly closed, medical personnel who were reassigned without explanation, soldiers who were left without proper medical records for injuries that officially never happened. Sarah stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Denver skyline while she processed what Torres had told her. The city looked peaceful in the afternoon sunlight, a stark contrast to the darkness of the story she was hearing. Below, people went about their daily lives, unaware that the system they trusted to protect them had betrayed the very people who had sacrificed everything in its defense. How many others? She asked without turning around. How many soldiers were abandoned like you and your team? We think at least 50 from the operations we've been able to identify. Probably more. They're scattered across the country, dealing with medical problems they can't get treated, psychological trauma they can't discuss, and financial difficulties because they can't access the benefits they earned. Sarah turned back to face Torres, and he saw something in her expression that reminded him of the determined doctor who had refused to let him die in a bombed-out building. The same fierce commitment to saving lives, but now directed at a larger problem than any single patient. What do you want from me? She asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Help us expose what happened. Help us get justice for the guys who died because they couldn't get medical treatment. Help us make sure this never happens to other soldiers. Torres's voice was strong now, despite his physical weakness. "You're the only one who has the medical expertise to document what was done to us, and the only one with clean enough hands to be believed when you testify." Sarah realized that her quiet life at the VA hospital was over. The careful distance she had maintained from her military past had been an illusion. The soldiers she had treated in that field hospital had never really left her care, and now they needed her to save them in a different way. "If I do this, if I help you expose what happened, it will destroy my career," she said. "The military will come after me with everything they have. They'll discredit me, destroy my reputation, make it impossible for me to practice medicine." Torres met her eyes with the same steady gaze he had maintained while she worked to save his life years earlier. "I know what I'm asking, Doc. But those guys who died, they trusted the system to take care of them after they sacrificed everything for their country. That trust was betrayed. If we don't fight for them now, who will?" Sarah looked at the man whose life she had saved, who had spent 3 years carrying wounds that officially didn't exist, seeking treatment for injuries that officially never happened. She thought about the other soldiers Torres had mentioned, scattered and suffering, abandoned by the system they had served with honor. The choice was clear, even though the consequences would be devastating. She had become a doctor to save lives, and sometimes saving lives required more than surgery. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the hospital earlier than usual. She had spent the night making preparations for what she knew would be the most important decision of her professional life. Torres was scheduled for release in 2 days, his heart finally functioning properly after years of deterioration. But his physical healing was only the beginning of a much larger battle that they would have to fight together. Dr. Martinez found her in her office, surrounded by medical files and legal documents. He knocked on the open door, his expression concerned. Sarah had worked with him long enough that he could read her moods, and today she carried the weight of someone preparing for war. "Sarah, is everything all right? You've seemed different since yesterday's surgery." "That was excellent work, by the way. The patient's recovery has been remarkable." Sarah looked up from the documents she had been reviewing. She had spent hours cross-referencing Torres's medical history with the techniques she remembered from their time at the field hospital. The evidence was overwhelming when properly documented by someone with her expertise and direct knowledge of the events. "David, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me," she said. "Have you ever encountered patients with injuries that couldn't be properly documented? Military personnel whose service records were incomplete or classified?" Dr. Martinez sat down across from her desk, his expression becoming serious. "More often than I'd like to admit. We see veterans who clearly have service-related injuries, but their medical records are insufficient to support disability claims. It's frustrating because we know they're entitled to care, but the bureaucracy makes it nearly impossible to help them. What if I told you that some of those cases might be the result of deliberate cover-ups, operations that were classified to hide misconduct rather than protect national security?" Martinez leaned back in his chair, studying Sarah's face carefully. He had known her for 3 years as a competent, rational physician who avoided drama and focused on patient care. This conversation was completely outside her normal behavior pattern. "I'd say that's a serious accusation that would require serious evidence," he replied. "I'd also say that making such accusations could have serious consequences for your career and this hospital's relationship with the military medical system." Sarah appreciated his honesty, even though it confirmed what she already knew. What she was considering would put everything at risk: her job, her reputation, possibly even her freedom. But the alternative was allowing Torres and soldiers like him to continue suffering in silence, while the people responsible for their abandonment faced no consequences. "David, I want you to look at something," she said, turning her computer monitor toward him. On the screen was Torres's current medical imaging, showing the evidence of her field surgery from 3 years earlier, alongside the repairs she had made yesterday. "Look at the pattern of the original injuries and the field repairs that kept this patient alive." Martinez studied the images with professional interest. "This is remarkable work. The field surgeon who performed these repairs saved this patient's life under what must have been extremely difficult conditions. The level of skill and improvisation is extraordinary." "I performed those field repairs," Sarah said quietly, 3 years ago, in a classified facility, under circumstances that officially never happened." The silence in the office was complete except for the distant sounds of hospital activity. Martinez stared at the medical images, then at Sarah, then back at the images. She could see him processing the implications of what she had told him. Sarah, are you certain about this? Because if what you're suggesting is true, then this patient's injuries are the result of a classified military operation, and discussing them could violate numerous federal laws. I'm certain, Sarah replied. And there are others. Soldiers who were treated at the same facility, who are now dealing with medical problems they can't get help for because their service records have been sealed or destroyed. Sarah spent the next hour walking Martinez through the evidence she had compiled. Torres's case was just one piece of a larger pattern of abandonment and cover-up that reached far beyond a single operation. She showed him medical records that had been heavily redacted, disability claims that had been denied despite clear evidence of service-related injuries, and documentation of soldiers who had died from treatable conditions because they couldn't access appropriate medical care. This is bigger than I thought, Martinez said after reviewing the evidence. This isn't just about one classified operation. This appears to be a systematic pattern of abandoning soldiers whose injuries are politically inconvenient. That's why I need your help, Sarah said. I can document the medical evidence, but I need institutional support to make sure this information reaches the right people. If I try to do this alone, they'll destroy me and bury the evidence. Martinez was quiet for several minutes, weighing the risks and benefits of getting involved. Sarah could see him struggling with the same decision she had faced the night before. Supporting her would put his own career at risk, but ignoring the evidence would mean abandoning soldiers who had sacrificed everything for their country. What exactly are you proposing? He asked finally. I want to compile a comprehensive medical report documenting the cases we can identify. I want to present this evidence to Congress, to the media, to anyone who will listen and act on it. I want to make sure that Torres and soldiers like him get the medical care they're entitled to. And I want to make sure the people responsible for abandoning them face consequences. You understand that this will likely end your career in military medicine? The Pentagon won't tolerate this kind of exposure, and they have ways of making life very difficult for people who embarrass them. Sarah nodded. I understand the risks, but these soldiers trusted me to save their lives, and I can't save them completely until I help them get justice. They've been carrying wounds that go beyond the physical. Wounds that come from being abandoned by the system they served with honor. Martinez stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains that surrounded Denver. When he turned back to Sarah, his expression was resolute. I'll help you, but we need to be smart about this. We need to document everything carefully, involve the right people from the beginning, and make sure we have legal protection before we go public. Thank you, David. I know what I'm asking of you. You're asking me to do what we both swore to do when we became doctors, Martinez replied. To heal the sick and protect the vulnerable. If we don't stand up for these soldiers, who will? As they began planning their approach, Sarah felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from her life since leaving the military. For 3 years, she had focused on healing individual patients while trying to forget the larger wounds that existed in the system she had served. Now she had the opportunity to address those systemic problems, to fight for justice on behalf of soldiers who had been forgotten and abandoned. The battle ahead would be difficult and dangerous, but it was a battle worth fighting. Torres had risked his life for his country, and now it was time for Sarah to risk everything to ensure that his sacrifice and the sacrifices of soldiers like him were properly honored and supported. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood before a packed congressional hearing room, her hands steady despite the gravity of the moment. The room was filled with reporters, military officials, veterans advocates, and family members of soldiers who had been affected by the systematic abandonment she was about to expose. Torres sat in the front row, his presence a reminder of why she was risking everything to tell this story. The path to this moment had been treacherous. Within days of beginning her investigation, Sarah had received warnings from military officials suggesting that she was venturing into dangerous territory. Her security clearance had been suspended, and there had been hints that her medical license could be challenged if she continued pursuing the matter. But the evidence she and Martinez had compiled was too overwhelming to ignore, and they had managed to attract the attention of a congressional subcommittee investigating military medical care. Congressman James Bradley, a veteran himself and the chairman of the subcommittee, called the hearing to order. His expression was serious as he addressed the room full of people seeking answers about how their government had failed the soldiers who had sacrificed everything in its service. Dr. Chen, he began, you have made serious allegations about the systematic abandonment of military personnel who were injured in classified operations. These are grave accusations that, if proven true, represent a fundamental betrayal of the trust our service members place in their government. Please tell us what you know. Sarah had rehearsed this moment dozens of times, but facing the reality of it was different than any preparation could have provided. She thought of Johnson, who had died of a heart attack at 32 because he couldn't get treatment for injuries that officially never happened. She thought of Peterson, who had taken his own life because the pain became unbearable and no one would help him. She thought of all the soldiers scattered across the country, suffering in silence because their sacrifices had been deemed politically inconvenient. Mr. Chairman, 3 years ago I served as a cardiac surgeon at a classified medical facility, where I treated soldiers who had been injured in operations that officially do not exist. These men and women suffered severe injuries while serving their country with honor and distinction. When the operation was deemed politically sensitive, rather than ensuring these soldiers received proper ongoing medical care, the military chose to classify their injuries and abandon them to suffer in silence. Sarah's voice was steady and clear as she presented the evidence she and Martinez had compiled. Medical records that showed clear patterns of service-related injuries being denied treatment. Documentation of soldiers who had died from treatable conditions because they couldn't access appropriate medical care. Expert medical testimony that proved the injuries in question could only have resulted from combat operations. Staff Sergeant Torres, who is here today, lived for 3 years with a deteriorating heart condition that I had repaired under battlefield conditions. When he sought help at VA hospitals, he was told that his injuries couldn't be documented because the operation where he was hurt was classified. He was left to suffer and potentially die because acknowledging his injuries would have been politically embarrassing to officials who had sent him into a trap. The room was silent except for the clicking of cameras and the scratch of reporters taking notes. Sarah could see the impact her words were having on the people in the audience. Some were crying, others were angry, but all of them were finally hearing the truth about how their government had betrayed the people who had sacrificed everything to serve it. General Patricia Harrison, representing the Pentagon, sat at another table, her expression carefully neutral but her posture tense. Sarah knew that Harrison and her colleagues had come prepared to discredit her testimony, to challenge her credentials, and suggest that she was a disgruntled former employee making false accusations. But the evidence was too strong and too well documented for simple denial. Dr. Chen, interrupted Congressman Williams, a known supporter of military leadership. These are serious accusations you're making. Do you have any proof that this alleged abandonment was deliberate, rather than simply bureaucratic oversight? Sarah had expected this challenge. She opened a folder and removed a document that she placed on the table in front of her. Sir, this is a memorandum dated 6 months after the operation in question. It was written by Colonel Marcus Webb, who was the commanding officer responsible for medical logistics in the region. The memo explicitly states that soldiers injured in the operation should not be given access to their complete medical records because doing so would compromise ongoing classified activities. She read from the document. Medical personnel who treated subjects during Operation Silent Thunder should be reassigned immediately. All medical records related to this operation should be classified at the highest level. Soldiers seeking treatment for related injuries should be discouraged from pursuing VA benefits that would require detailed documentation of their service. The impact of this evidence was immediate and dramatic. The congressional panel exchanged glances that spoke to the gravity of what they were hearing. General Harrison's carefully neutral expression cracked, and Sarah could see her calculating how to respond to evidence that directly contradicted the Pentagon's position. Where did you obtain this document? Harrison demanded. If authentic, it would be classified material that you have no authority to possess. The document was provided to me by a source within the military medical system who was troubled by what they had witnessed, Sarah replied. Someone with a conscience who couldn't stand to watch soldiers suffer in silence, while the people responsible for their abandonment escaped accountability. Congressman Bradley leaned forward, his expression intense. General Harrison, is this document authentic? Did Colonel Webb write this memorandum ordering the abandonment of soldiers injured in the line of duty? Harrison's hesitation was all the answer the room needed. When she finally spoke, her words were carefully chosen but couldn't disguise the truth. The document appears to be authentic, but it was written in the context of protecting ongoing intelligence operations. The security of future missions had to be considered alongside individual medical needs. You're saying that the Pentagon made a deliberate decision to abandon wounded soldiers in order to protect bureaucratic interests? Bradley's voice carried a mix of incredulity and anger that reflected the mood of the entire room. Sarah watched as the truth finally emerged into the light. The systematic abandonment of soldiers like Torres hadn't been an accident or bureaucratic oversight. It had been a deliberate decision made by officials who valued political convenience more than the lives of the people they were supposed to protect. Torres rose from his seat, his movement causing a stir in the hearing room. When the chairman recognized him, he spoke with the clear, strong voice of a soldier who had found his courage again. "Mr. Chairman, Dr. Chen saved my life 3 years ago when everyone else had given up on me. She saved my life again 3 weeks ago when she chose to risk everything to tell the truth about what happened to me and my brothers in arms. She's shown more honor and integrity in this room today than the entire chain of command that abandoned us when we needed them most." The hearing room erupted in applause, and Sarah felt tears she had been holding back finally begin to fall. She had risked everything to tell this story, and now the truth was finally being heard by people who had the power to demand justice. 6 months after the congressional hearing, Sarah stood in the same hospital corridor where she had first encountered Torres as an unnamed patient fighting for his life. But everything had changed. The quiet VA hospital had become a center of innovation and hope for veterans who had previously been abandoned by the system. The exposure of the systematic cover-up had created waves of reform that reached far beyond the walls of any single medical facility. The congressional investigation had led to criminal charges against Colonel Webb and several other officers who had participated in the conspiracy to abandon wounded soldiers. More importantly, it had resulted in the creation of a special medical program for veterans whose service records had been classified or destroyed. Torres had been appointed as a liaison, helping to identify and assist other soldiers who had been left without proper medical care. Sarah's career had indeed been destroyed, just as she had predicted. The military medical establishment had closed ranks against her, making it impossible for her to work in any military-affiliated facility. Her security clearance had been permanently revoked, and several medical institutions had quietly declined to offer her positions due to pressure from government officials. But from that destruction had come something better. The publicity from the congressional hearing had led to offers from civilian medical institutions and veterans advocacy groups. Sarah now directed a special clinic that provided free medical care to veterans whose service records were incomplete or classified. The clinic was funded by private donations and staffed by doctors who understood that sometimes healing required more than medical expertise. Dr. Martinez had joined her at the clinic, bringing several other physicians who had become disgusted with the military medical bureaucracy. Together, they had created a model program that other cities were beginning to replicate. The work was challenging and often heartbreaking, but it was also deeply rewarding in ways that standard medical practice had never been. Torres had made a complete physical recovery, his heart functioning perfectly thanks to Sarah's surgical skill and the proper follow-up care he finally received. But more importantly, he had found purpose in helping other veterans navigate the complex process of getting medical care and benefits for injuries that officially didn't exist. His combination of military experience and personal understanding of the system's failures made him an effective advocate for soldiers who had given up hope. "Dr. Chen, we have a new patient I think you should see," Torres said as he approached her office. He had been working at the clinic for 3 months now, and Sarah had come to rely on his judgment about which cases required her personal attention. "What's the situation?" Sarah asked, looking up from the medical journals she had been reviewing. Staying current with cardiac surgery techniques remained important even though her practice now focused on a specialized population. Marine corporal, injured in an operation that was apparently classified after the fact. Similar pattern to what we saw with my case, but this one involves potential neurological damage from an explosion. The patient has been experiencing symptoms for 2 years but can't get proper evaluation because the military claims no record of the incident. Sarah nodded, familiar with the pattern by now. The congressional investigation had revealed that the practice of classifying operations retroactively to hide embarrassing failures had been far more widespread than anyone had initially realized. Dozens of soldiers had been left in medical limbo, unable to prove service connection for injuries that everyone knew were the result of their military service. "Set up an appointment for tomorrow," Sarah said, "and see if you can track down any other members of the unit. Sometimes they can provide corroborating testimony, even if the official records have been buried." As Torres left to make the arrangements, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed. The quiet routine of civilian medicine had been replaced by something more challenging, but ultimately more meaningful. Each patient at the clinic represented a failure of the system she had once served, but also an opportunity to provide the care and support that should have been there from the beginning. Her computer chimed with an incoming email, and Sarah smiled when she saw the sender's name. It was from Johnson's widow, who had become an advocate for military families dealing with similar situations. The email contained photos from a memorial ceremony that had been held to honor her husband and other veterans who had died from service-related injuries that couldn't be documented. The ceremony had been attended by hundreds of people, including many veterans who had benefited from the reforms triggered by Sarah's testimony. The personal cost of her decision to speak out had been significant. Sarah lived alone in a small apartment, her savings depleted by legal bills and the period of unemployment after leaving the VA hospital. She had lost friends who disapproved of her decision to challenge the military establishment, and she knew that certain doors would be permanently closed to her because of her reputation as a whistleblower. But she had also gained something invaluable. The soldiers she treated at the clinic looked at her with the same trust and respect she had seen in Torres's eyes during that desperate surgery in Fallujah. She was finally able to complete the healing process she had begun on that distant battlefield, not just repairing physical damage but addressing the deeper wounds created by abandonment and betrayal. Torres returned with information about the new patient, and as they discussed the case, Sarah was struck by how naturally they worked together. The doctor and the soldier, united by shared experience of combat and shared commitment to healing its invisible wounds. They had both sacrificed careers and certainties to fight for justice, and both had found something better in the process. "You know," Torres said as they finished reviewing the medical files, "sometimes I think about what would have happened if you hadn't been in that operating room when they brought me in 3 weeks ago. I probably would have died the way Johnson died, alone and forgotten by the system I served." Sarah considered his words, thinking about the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. A chance surgery had reconnected her with a patient she had saved years earlier, and that reconnection had led to exposing a conspiracy that reached high into the military command structure. The silence she had maintained for 3 years had been broken by the simple fact of recognition, by the moment when Torres had looked at her and said her name. "I think everything happened the way it was supposed to," she replied. "You found your way to me when you needed help, and helping you led me to find my way back to the work I was meant to do." As evening fell over Denver, Sarah prepared to leave the clinic for the day. Tomorrow would bring new patients with new stories of service and abandonment, new opportunities to heal wounds that went beyond the physical. The quiet life she had built after leaving the military was gone forever, replaced by something more challenging but infinitely more meaningful. Walking to her car, Sarah thought about the congressional hearing and the moment when Torres had stood to speak. The room had fallen completely silent as he testified, recognizing that they were hearing from someone who had lived through the betrayal they were investigating. In that silence, Sarah had finally understood why she had become a doctor and why her service would never really end. Some wounds could only be healed by refusing to stay silent about the injuries that caused them. The soldiers she treated had carried their pain alone for too long, abandoned by a system that preferred silence to accountability. By breaking her own silence, Sarah had given them their voices back and found her own purpose in the process. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in 3 years, Sarah felt like she was exactly where she belonged.